My own daughter, the child I raised and loved for 40 years, stood in the doorway of my home, her face twisted into a mask of cold indifference. She had just inherited my late husband's entire $33 million fortune, and her first act was to throw me out onto the street with $200 and a horrifying command. Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now. I was homeless, heartbroken, and 67 years old. But what my daughter didn't know was that my husband had left behind one final, devastating secret. Days later, when the truth came out at the bank, a manager would look at her forged papers, laugh, and ask, "Ma'am, did you read the real will?" Her face would drain of all color, because that will contained a clause that would not only cost her every penny, but would also set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a dark world of crime and deception she could never have imagined. If you're listening to this, I'd appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. This is a story I have to tell. Before I get into the details, I'd love to know what city or country you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. My story starts on a quiet, leafy street in Chicago, in a home I thought was mine for 43 years. My life with Arthur was for the most part a good one. He was a product of his time. A traditional, hard-working man who believed a husband's duty was to provide, and a wife's duty was to manage the home. And I did. I lovingly polished the oak banister until it shone. I chose the curtains that caught the morning light just so, and I learned to cook his favorite meal, pot roast, until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. I gave up a promising career in art, packing away my canvases and oils to raise our daughter Jessica, to host his business dinners, to be the silent, supportive partner to his ambition. I never thought of it as a sacrifice. I saw it as my contribution to our family, our legacy. Arthur was a brilliant financial consultant, and from a small office with a second-hand desk, he built an empire. He was meticulous, organized, and at times a bit controlling, especially about money. He'd pat my hand, a gesture that was both affectionate and dismissive, and say, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about this, Eleanor." Whenever I asked about the complex world of investments, I let him. I trusted him completely. After all, he was the architect of our comfortable life. Our daughter, Jessica, was the absolute center of his world. From the moment she was born, she could do no wrong in his eyes. I remember when she was 16, she dented the side of his prized Cadillac. I was preparing for a storm, but Arthur just chuckled, tweaked her nose, and said, "That's my girl. Got your mother's driving skills." He paid for her Ivy League education, her first convertible, the down payment on the sprawling suburban home she shared with her husband, Mark, a slick investment broker who always had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When Jessica gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren, Arthur's devotion only deepened. I was just the woman in the background, the one who made sure the pot roast was perfect and the grandchildren had their favorite cookies. I was the wallpaper of our family's life, always there but rarely truly seen. Then, 6 months ago, the architect of my life was gone. Arthur had a massive heart attack while reading the morning paper, the financial section still clutched in his hand. He was gone in an instant. At 71, the man who had been the bedrock of my entire adult life vanished, and my world simply fell apart. The grief was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket I couldn't escape. The house, once filled with his booming laughter and the scent of his cigars, was suddenly cavernous and silent. Jessica and Mark swooped in, their faces etched with what I desperately wanted to believe was real concern. "Oh, Mom, you can't possibly manage this big house alone," Jessica would say, her voice dripping with a sympathy that felt rehearsed. "The stairs, the memories, the upkeep. It's just not healthy for you." They were so convincing, so caring. I thought their concern was genuine. A daughter's love for her grieving mother. I couldn't have been more wrong. In the immediate aftermath of Arthur's funeral, the house was filled with a revolving door of well-meaning neighbors bringing casseroles and offering condolences. Through it all, Jessica and Mark were my shadows, their presence a constant, low hum of anxiety I couldn't quite place. Their conversations were like a carefully rehearsed play, always circling back to my future, my inability to cope. They'd leave glossy brochures on the coffee table for places with names like Golden Meadows and Serenity Gardens. "Look, Mom, they have a pool," Mark would say with forced cheerfulness, "and a book club. You'd love it." They spoke of my home as if it were a burden, a dusty museum of a life that was over, instead of the place where I had raised my child and loved my husband. What they meant, I'd soon learn. was no more inconvenient mother standing between them and a fortune. The first real undeniable sign of their true intentions came not with a bang, but with a quiet digital rejection. I was at the grocery store. A simple weekly errand that had suddenly become a monumental task. The aisles felt too bright, the choices overwhelming. I was just trying to get through it, to perform some semblance of normalcy. At the checkout, the cart was filled with simple things: milk, bread, the ingredients for a soup I had no appetite for. I handed the cashier my credit card, the one I'd used for 30 years. She swiped it. A harsh beep cut through the store's soft music. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her young face filled with pity. "It's declined." "That's impossible," I stammered, my cheeks flushing hot with embarrassment. "Try it again, please." She did. Same result. The people in line behind me were starting to shift impatiently. Fumbling, I pulled out my debit card. "Declined. Account frozen," the little screen read. Frozen? My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the joint account, the one that held our life savings. I had to mumble an apology, leave the full cart of groceries, and walk out of the store under a cloud of shame and confusion. I rushed home, my hands trembling as I dialed the bank's customer service number. After 20 minutes of dreadful hold music, a sterile voice delivered the news. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance, but the joint account was frozen and subsequently closed upon the request of the executor of Mr. Vance's estate, a Miss Jessica Prescott." Jessica. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. My own daughter had cut me off from my own money, without a single word. That evening their car pulled into the driveway. They didn't come to the door with casseroles or condolences. They came with 2 large, empty suitcases. They walked past me into the foyer as if they already owned the place, their shoes echoing on the hardwood floors I had polished that very morning. Jessica turned, her expression unreadable. "Mom, we need to talk." I stared at her, the banker's words still ringing in my ears. "You closed our accounts," I whispered. It wasn't a question. "I didn't have a choice," she said, the lie slipping so easily from her lips. "It's part of managing Dad's estate." She then pulled a sheaf of papers from her designer handbag, stapled and official-looking. "This is a copy of Dad's will. I am the sole beneficiary. The house, the investments, all of it. It's mine now." The papers trembled in my hand. It looked real. The legal jargon, the signatures, it all looked real. "No," I said, shaking my head, my world tilting on its axis. "That can't be right. Your father. He would never." That's when her mask of false sympathy finally crumbled, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. Her eyes, the same blue eyes I'd gazed into as I rocked her to sleep as a baby, turned to chips of ice. "Actually, Mom, he did. He knew I'd be a better steward of his legacy." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I've been letting you stay here out of the kindness of my heart, but my patience has run out. Mark and I are moving in. It's time for you to go." I was speechless, the betrayal a physical blow that stole the air from my lungs. And then she delivered the final soul-crushing sentence. "Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." Mark, silent until then, began efficiently packing 2 suitcases with a random assortment of my clothes and toiletries. They walked me to the door of my own home. A home I had polished and painted and filled with love. Mark pressed $200 in cash into my hand. "For the first few nights," he said, not meeting my eyes. Then they closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the silent night. Standing on the sidewalk watching the door to my own home slam shut, I felt a cold dread. But underneath the shock, a tiny persistent question began to form in my mind. The Chicago night air was cold, but the chill that seeped into my bones had nothing to do with the weather. It was the icy finality of that locked door. The profound silence where a life used to be. I stood there on the manicured lawn I had watered just 2 days before, my 2 suitcases a pathetic summary of a 43-year marriage. The $200 in my hand felt like both a grotesque insult and my only lifeline. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down on the pristine sidewalk. Pride or maybe just shock straightened my spine. I managed to hail a taxi, the driver a kind-faced man who saw my suitcases and the look on my face and didn't ask any questions. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked gently. The question was a chasm. Where does a 67-year-old woman with $200 and no credit cards go? My friends were their friends, couples Arthur and I had socialized with for years. The thought of calling them, of explaining this monstrous humiliation, was more than I could bear. So, I did the only thing I could think of. Take me to the cheapest, cleanest motel you know of, I said, my voice hoarse. Somewhere out toward the suburbs. He dropped me off at the Starlight Inn. The name was a cruel joke. The only star was the one flickering weakly on its rusted, buzzing sign. The man behind the plexiglass window took 60 of my precious dollars and slid a key attached to a large plastic fob across the counter. Room 107. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, industrial-strength bleach, and a deep lingering despair. The carpet was a tapestry of mysterious stains, the wallpaper was peeling in damp strips near the window unit, and the single bed sagged in the middle as if countless other defeated souls had collapsed onto it before me. I set my suitcases down and sat on the edge of that lumpy mattress, the thin, scratchy bedspread rough beneath my fingers. And in the oppressive silence of that miserable room, I finally allowed myself to cry. Great racking sobs that tore through my body for my husband, for my home, for the daughter I thought I knew. I cried until I had no tears left, until I was just a hollowed-out shell of a woman. I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. To be thrown out by your own child, left in a place like that with nothing. What would you have done? Where would you have turned for help? Let me know in the comments. I truly want to know what you think. After the tears subsided, exhaustion gave way to a strange, cold clarity. In the depressing silence of that motel room, with the hum of the ice machine outside my door as my only companion, my mind replayed the last few weeks, and the question that had formed on my porch grew louder, more insistent. It didn't make sense. Arthur was a planner. He was obsessively, almost maddeningly organized. This was a man who labeled his spice rack alphabetically. He had files for the warranties on appliances we hadn't owned in a decade. A man like that doesn't leave behind a sloppy, cruel will that disinherits his wife. And then I remembered, with a jolt of certainty that cut through the fog of my grief, a conversation from 5 years ago. We were in his study. The air smelled of old books and his pipe tobacco. He had slid a thick leather-bound folder across his mahogany desk. "Eleanor," he'd said, his tone unusually serious, "this is my will. I want you to know what's in it. I want you to be protected always." He had walked me through the key provisions, making sure I understood. He had looked me right in the eye and promised me I would always be taken care of, that the house would always be mine. The man who made that promise was not the man who would leave his wife of 43 years destitute. Arthur could be stubborn, he could be old-fashioned, but he was not cruel. The will Jessica had shown me felt wrong. It was a forgery. It had to be. That single thought was a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was a lifeline. It was a reason to fight. The next morning, I used the motel's spotty Wi-Fi and my dwindling cash to figure out my next move. I looked up the name of the one man Arthur had trusted with all his legal affairs for over 30 years, David Chun. His office was downtown. It felt a world away, but I knew I had to get there. As I walked into that polished downtown law office, I had no idea that I wasn't just seeking answers. I was about to start a war. The law firm of Chun and Associates was on the 40th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Chicago skyline. The elevator ride alone felt like an ascent into another world. A world of hushed voices, expensive leather, and the quiet, confident hum of money and power. I felt small and out of place in my crumpled clothes from the day before, clutching my handbag as if it were a shield against the curious glances of smartly dressed paralegals. The air smelled of success, a scent I had forgotten. The receptionist, a young woman with a flawless manicure, eyed me with polite suspicion. My reflection in the polished marble floor showed a tired, frightened old woman. But when I said the name, her expression shifted. "I'm here to see David Chun. My name is Eleanor Vance." A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by concern. "Of course, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Chun has been expecting to hear from you. Please come this way." David Chun was a man in his late 60s, with a face that was both kind and sharp, framed by silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He rose from behind a desk the size of a small boat and greeted me with a warm handshake, but his expression was one of deep puzzlement. "Eleanor, my dear, it's good to see you. though I wish it were under better circumstances. My deepest condolences on Arthur's passing. He was a fine man. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair that sighed as I sank into it. I must admit I was surprised, he continued, settling back into his own chair. I've called your home several times over the past week, but Jessica informed me you were traveling abroad. Said you'd gone to Europe to clear your head, that you were too distraught to deal with legal matters, and that she would handle everything on your behalf. The blood drained from my face. Traveling abroad. The lie was so audacious, so complete. It was designed to isolate me, to cut me off from the one person who could expose her scheme. Mr. Chun, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the shame of it all washing over me again. I haven't been traveling. I spent last night in a $60 motel. Jessica. She told me I inherited nothing. She showed me a will that left everything to her. She kicked me out of my own home. The kindness in David Chen's eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a steely protective alarm. He didn't question me. He didn't doubt me for a second. The flicker of indignation in his eyes told me he knew Arthur, and he knew this story didn't fit the man. He simply stood up, his movements swift and urgent, and walked over to a massive fireproof filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder with Vance Arthur J. printed in bold letters on the tab. Eleanor, what you're describing is not just immoral. It's a felony. The document she showed you must be a forgery. He laid the folder on his desk and opened it with a decisive flick of his wrist. There on top was the official notarized last will and testament of Arthur J. Vance, bound in a crisp blue cover. I recognized my husband's neat, forceful signature at the bottom, witnessed by two people I knew from his club. David cleared his throat and began to read. I, Arthur James Vance, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the following. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I held my breath, praying that my memory, my faith in my husband was not misplaced. To my beloved wife Eleanor Vance, I leave our primary residence located at 847 Oakwood Drive, Chicago, Illinois, including all furnishings and personal effects contained therein. A sob escaped my lips, a sound I couldn't contain. My home. It was mine. The foundation of my life was still there. David paused, his gaze softening for a moment, before he continued. His voice grew stronger, each word a stone being laid back into my shattered world. Furthermore, I leave to my wife, Eleanor, 70% of all my financial assets, including all investment portfolios, bank accounts, stocks, and bonds. He looked up from the page, his eyes meeting mine, removing his glasses as if to make sure I truly understood. Eleanor, at its current valuation, that amounts to approximately $23 million. $23 million. The room started to spin. I gripped the arms of the leather chair to steady myself. The number was so vast, so incomprehensible. From $200 in a cheap motel to $23 million in a lawyer's office. The whiplash was dizzying. Tears streamed down my face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief that was so intense it felt like pain. My husband hadn't abandoned me. My memories of his love and care were real. He had protected me. I thought that was the biggest shock of the day. But then Mr. Chun kept reading, and what he said next changed everything. David let me have a moment, pushing a box of tissues across the gleaming expanse of his desk. My hands were shaking as I took one. There's more, Eleanor, he said softly, his voice cutting through my dazed relief. And I think this next part is something Arthur specifically wrote with a situation like this in mind. He was a brilliant man, but he wasn't a blind one. He adjusted his glasses, a grim but satisfied look on his face, and continued reading from the will. To my daughter Jessica Vance Prescott, I leave the remaining 30% of my financial assets, totaling approximately $10 million. My mind reeled. Even after everything, he had still left her a fortune. A part of me, the mother in me, felt a confusing pang of relief for her, quickly followed by a surge of anger. How could he reward her? But David held up a hand, his expression telling me to be patient, to listen. Here is the crucial part, Eleanor. Arthur made this section ironclad. This inheritance is to be held in a secure trust, with distributions to begin only upon her 45th birthday. The establishment and continuation of this trust are entirely contingent upon one single, non-negotiable condition. He paused for effect, his eyes boring into mine over the rims of his glasses. Contingent upon her honorable and respectful treatment of her mother, Eleanor Vance, following my death. The room fell silent. Contingent upon her treatment of me. The words echoed in the quiet air-conditioned space. It was a test. A final test of character for his beloved princess. David continued reading the fine print, and Arthur's genius, his almost painful foresight, became terrifyingly clear. Arthur, the meticulous planner, had left nothing to chance. The will explicitly defined what constituted disrespectful treatment. It was a list that read like a prophecy of Jessica's actions. It included but was not limited to any attempt to remove me from my home, any action that caused me financial or emotional distress, any failure to ensure my comfort and well-being, and any misrepresentation of my wishes or condition to others. He had her cornered. It was as if Arthur had seen the future. As if he had finally acknowledged the darkness lurking in his beloved daughter's heart. The will further stipulates, David read, his voice like a judge's gavel striking down a final verdict. Should my daughter, Jessica, fail to meet this condition in any way, as determined by the executor of my estate, and Eleanor, that executor is me, the aforementioned trust in her name shall be immediately and irrevocably dissolved. The entire sum of $10 million, along with any accrued interest, will revert in full to my wife, Eleanor Vance, to be hers absolutely. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer brilliance of the trap. It was a perfect, posthumous maneuver, a moral and financial checkmate from beyond the grave. Jessica, in her mad, greedy rush to claim everything, hadn't just been cruel. She had been a fool. She had walked right into the snare her father had so carefully laid. She had personally triggered the very clause designed to disinherit her. She hadn't just lost the $23 million she tried to steal. She had forfeited the $10 million that was rightfully hers. Mr. Chun, I whispered, the full weight of it finally landing, making me feel both lightheaded and immensely powerful. Are you saying? A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen on the thick document. Yes, Eleanor. I am saying your daughter just played herself out of $10 million. Her inheritance is now yours. All of it. You are not the beneficiary of $23 million. You are the sole legal heir to Arthur's entire $33 million estate, plus the house and all its contents. Jessica gets nothing. Absolutely nothing. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. She had called me useless, a worthless old woman to be discarded. But in the end, my dignity, my well-being, was the key that unlocked the entire fortune. Arthur hadn't just left me his money. He had left me his power. My daughter thought she was playing checkers, but my husband had been playing chess his entire life. And now it was my move. The fog of grief and shock that had clouded my mind for weeks finally burned away, replaced by the clean, cold fire of anger. David Chin's office transformed from a place of revelation into a war room. He seemed to relish the fight, a seasoned warrior glad to be back on the battlefield. He leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eye, and dubbed it Operation Reclamation. First things first, he said, his fingers already flying across his keyboard as he spoke. We report the fraud. Elder financial abuse is a serious crime, Eleanor. What Jessica and Mark have done isn't just a family squabble. It's a federal offense. They forged a legal document and attempted to defraud an estate of millions of dollars. The district attorney's office will be very interested in this. While he was on the phone with a contact at the DA's office, his assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara, was on another line, methodically contacting every bank and investment firm Arthur had ever worked with. The process was brutally efficient. We faxed them copies of the real, notarized will and a cease and desist letter drafted by David that was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Jessica. It was like watching a dam break in real time. Within 3 hours, every single account she had managed to get her hands on was frozen solid. The primary estate account, which she had no doubt been planning to plunder, was locked. The investment portfolio she thought she controlled was frozen. Every dollar, every stock, every asset was locked down pending a criminal investigation. She was cut off. I sat in a plush chair, sipping the first decent cup of tea I'd had in what felt like a lifetime, and watched a master at work. David was calm, precise, and utterly ruthless on my behalf. It was intoxicating. For the first time since Arthur died, I felt safe. More than safe. I felt a surge of power that was entirely new to me. I had spent a lifetime being protected by my husband. Now I was learning to fight for myself. At exactly 3:47 p.m. my cell phone, which I'd been keeping charged at the office, buzzed to life on the desk. The caller ID flashed a name that now sent a jolt of ice, not fear, through my veins. Jessica. I looked at David. He nodded, a glint in his eye. Let's hear what she has to say. Put it on speaker. I took a deep breath, steadied my hand, and answered. Hello, Jessica. Mom? Where are you? What did you do? Her voice was high-pitched, a frantic panic squeal that was music to my ears. There's some kind of mistake with the bank accounts. They're saying Dad's assets are frozen. I was at Neiman Marcus and my card was declined. In front of everyone. Do you know how humiliating that was? The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of her complaint, after what she had done to me, was breathtaking. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea before replying, letting the silence stretch. There's no mistake, honey. I'm sitting here in David Chin's office. You remember him, don't you? Arthur's attorney. The one who was supposed to read the real will to you while you were telling him I was on a European vacation. There was a choked silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she desperately tried to formulate a new lie. Mom, she finally began, her voice shifting into that familiar, patronizing tone. I don't know what you think you've found, but you're clearly confused. You've been under a lot of stress. Oh, I'm not confused at all. I cut her off, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. I've discovered that you are a liar, a thief and a fraud. I've also discovered that your father was a much smarter man than either of us gave him credit for. I was protecting you, she shrieked, her desperation cracking through her facade. You don't understand complex finances. I was protecting the legacy. Protecting it by throwing your 67-year-old, grieving mother out of her own house with $200? I countered, my voice dangerously quiet. Here's a little financial lesson for you, Jessica. Thanks to a lovely little clause your father included about treating me with dignity, you not only lost the inheritance you tried to steal, but you also lost the $10 million he actually left you. It's all mine now. The silence that followed was profound. She was finally truly speechless. I hung up the phone, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. The police told Mr. Chun they had enough evidence for an arrest warrant. But I had no idea just how deep my son-in-law's own crimes ran. The call from David came later that evening, just as I was contemplating another lonely night in the motel. They got them, Eleanor, he said, a note of pure, unadulterated triumph in his voice. The police just arrested them. The details he shared were almost cinematic in their pathetic absurdity. The police had found Jessica and Mark at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, a lavish place known for its enormous steaks and even larger taps. Apparently, they were drowning their sorrows in vintage champagne and lobster, a last desperate act of living the high life on credit cards that were rapidly becoming useless plastic. The image was so perfectly, disgustingly them. According to the police report David was reading from, Jessica had made a huge scene, screaming about false arrest and demanding to call her lawyer, who turned out to be Mark's golf buddy. Mark, on the other hand, had simply sat there, pale and silent, the reality of his situation finally crashing down on him. The next morning the other shoe dropped, and it was a heavy one. Detectives working the fraud case had done a deep dive into Mark's financial history as part of their due diligence. What they found was a cesspool. My son-in-law, the slick investment broker, was a fraud through and through. He had a history of shady deals, of skirting the edges of the law. But his real problem was more personal. He had a severe gambling addiction, a secret he had managed to hide from Jessica, or perhaps one she had chosen to ignore. He was in debt up to his eyeballs to some very unsavory characters. The inheritance wasn't just about greed for him, it was a desperate lifeline to save him from being kneecapped or worse. The forged will wasn't some spur-of-the-moment crime born of grief and opportunity. It was a calculated, premeditated act. The forensics team traced the counterfeit documents to a specialty printer in a seedy part of town, a place Mark's firm had allegedly used in the past to create fraudulent investment prospectuses for other scams. He was a professional con artist. My daughter had married a crook, and suddenly her actions, while still monstrous, made a darker kind of sense. She was a passenger in his getaway car. That afternoon, David Chun insisted on driving me home himself. Home. The word itself felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. As we pulled into the familiar driveway, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet widow in her 80s with whom I'd exchanged pleasantries over the garden fence for 20 years, rushed out of her house. Her face was a mess of worry and relief. She had seen the whole horrible scene when Jessica had thrown me out. She'd watched the taxi pull away and had been beside herself with worry ever since. "Oh, Eleanor. I was so scared for you. I called the police after you left. I told them what that dreadful girl did. I didn't know where you went." Her simple act of kindness, of human decency, undid me. I collapsed into her frail, strong arms and cried, right there on the lawn. It was a stark reminder that while my own blood had betrayed me, the compassion of a near stranger had been my silent guard. Inside, the house felt cold and alien. Jessica had already started to impose her will on the place. Gaudy modern art sat where my familiar landscapes used to hang. My comfortable floral armchair had been pushed into a corner, replaced by a sleek, black leather chaise that looked like a prop from a science fiction movie. I spent the rest of the day methodically, almost ritually reclaiming my space. I packed every single thing she and Mark had brought into the house into black garbage bags. Their designer clothes, their expensive gadgets, their pretentious art. I piled it all on the front porch like the trash it was. Let them figure out how to collect it from jail. That night, for the first time in my life, I locked the doors not for safety from the outside world, but from my own child. As I lay in my own bed, in my own quiet house, I thought the worst was over. I thought the legal battle was over. But then, a new player entered the game, one with more money, more power, and a threat that could destroy not just my future, but my husband's entire legacy. A few days later, a sleek black Mercedes, the kind that whispers its expense rather than shouts it, purred into my driveway. A woman emerged, radiating an aura of old money and imperious disdain. She was impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her fingers laden with rings that caught the afternoon sun. It was Brenda Prescott, Mark's mother. I had met her only a handful of times at holidays and had always found her to be cold and condescending, a woman who looked at my lovingly maintained home as if it were a quaint but slightly shabby cottage. I opened the door before she could press the bell, deciding on a small act of taking control. "Mrs. Prescott," I said, my voice even betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "Eleanor," she replied, not as a greeting but as a summons. She breezed past me into my living room without being invited, her expensive perfume instantly colonizing the air. She surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the empty space where the gaudy art had been, before settling into my floral armchair as if it were her throne. I remained standing, crossing my arms. "There is nothing to talk about. Your son is a criminal who helped throw me out of my house." She waved a dismissive, manicured hand, the diamonds on her wrist flashing. "Kevin made some poor choices, certainly. He was under a great deal of stress, what with his financial pressures. And Jessica, as we both know, can be very persuasive. But prosecuting him seems so vindictive. It's terribly middle class. The audacity of her blaming my daughter for her son's felonies, and then insulting my entire existence in the same breath, was staggering. Vindictive. I repeated, my voice dangerously low. Your son forged legal documents to steal $33 million from me. He watched as his wife told me to go find a place to die. That's not a poor choice, Brenda. That's a sociopathic lack of a soul. She smiled then, a thin reptilian smile that didn't touch her cold eyes. She thought she had me figured out. A simple, grieving widow who could be intimidated and bought. Let's be practical, Eleanor. A messy public trial doesn't benefit anyone. It's bad for the family name. My family is prepared to compensate you for your inconvenience. She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a foul odor. Let's say $2 million. In exchange, you tell the district attorney you made a mistake, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding brought on by grief. The charges against Mark are dropped, and we can all move on with our lives. $2 million. She was offering me a fraction of what her son tried to steal, to make his crimes disappear. The insult was so profound it almost made me laugh out loud. No, I said simply. Her smile faltered, a small crack in her perfect facade. Don't be a fool. Think of the grandchildren. Do you want their father to be a convicted felon? He is a convicted felon, Brenda. He just hasn't been sentenced yet. I shot back. Her composure cracked completely. She stood up, her eyes flashing with a venomous anger. 5 million, she snapped, the words sharp and ugly. That's my final offer. Take it or I promise, you will regret it more than you can possibly imagine. The answer is no, I said, walking to the door and holding it open. Now, please get out of my house. She stalked to the door, then turned, her polished mask of superiority back in place. Her voice was pure poison. You should know that my legal team is very thorough. They've been looking into Arthur's business practices. They found some interesting information. It would be a terrible shame if your late husband's sterling reputation were to be dragged through the mud during his son-in-law's trial. Think about it, Eleanor. Who's the real criminal here? The threat hung in the air long after the Mercedes had disappeared down the street. What secrets had Arthur been keeping? I realized that to protect my future, I had to uncover the truth about my husband's past, no matter how ugly it might be. Brenda's threat echoed in my mind for days, a toxic, lingering whisper. What could she possibly have on Arthur? My husband was the most honest, by-the-book man I had ever known. He lectured me if I tried to round down our weight on a self-checkout scale at the grocery store. He was a man who believed in rules, in order, in reputation. Or so I had believed. The doubt she had planted was a poison, seeping into my memories of him, tainting 43 years of shared history. I called David Chan immediately, my voice trembling with a new kind of fear. It's a classic tactic, Eleanor, he assured me, his voice a calm anchor in my storm. It's called graymail. They're trying to dirty up the victim to make their own client look less guilty. They're trying to scare you into backing down. Whatever they think they have, it's likely nothing but smoke and mirrors. But I wasn't so sure. Brenda Prescott was not a woman who made empty threats. The certainty in her eyes had been real. I don't care, David, I said, my voice firming with resolve. I can't fight what I don't know. I want you to hire the best financial investigator you can find. I want them to go through every file, every transaction, every deal Arthur ever made from the day he opened his business. I won't be intimidated by ghosts. I need to know the truth. The investigator David recommended was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria Flores, a former IRS agent who specialized in forensic accounting. She had eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor that suggested she had seen the worst of human greed, and was thoroughly unimpressed by it. She spent the next week camped out in Arthur's study, my study now, a fortress of paperwork and digital files. I gave her unrestricted access to everything, from old dusty ledgers in the attic to the encrypted drives on his computer. At first, she found nothing but the records of a highly successful, meticulously documented career. Your husband was a genius at this, she commented one afternoon, holding up a file. But as she dug deeper into his older, pre-digital files from the 80s and 90s, her expression grew more serious. The cheerful updates ceased. She became quiet, focused, and her brow was constantly furrowed in concentration. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she called me into the study. The mahogany desk was no longer neat. It was covered in a chaotic spread of ledgers, bank statements, and flow charts she had drawn on a large white pad. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and bitter coffee. Mrs. Vance, she said, her tone grave, all business. I think you need to sit down and see this. She walked me through a labyrinth of transactions that made my head spin. Payments to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands with names like Apex Holdings and Oceanic Ventures. Consulting fees paid to companies that seemed to exist only on paper, with no offices or employees. It was a complex web of offshore accounts and layered transactions that were clearly, brilliantly designed to hide the origin and destination of vast sums of money. The truth she had painstakingly pieced together was uglier than I could have imagined. Arthur wasn't involved with the mob or anything so cinematic. His crime was quieter, more sophisticated, but no less illegal. For over a decade, at the height of his career, He had been the architect of a massive illegal tax evasion scheme for a syndicate of wealthy, powerful clients. He created the complex offshore structures that made their fortunes disappear from the eyes of the IRS. And for his services, he was paid handsomely, off the books, through the very same channels he created. A significant portion of Arthur's wealth, the foundation of the very fortune I had just inherited, was built on this criminal enterprise. The $33 million wasn't just the fruit of his legitimate labor. It was tainted. It was dirty money. I felt a wave of nausea. My entire life, my beautiful home, my comfortable existence, had it all been funded by lies? The man I had loved and respected was a white-collar criminal. The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. Brenda Prescott hadn't been bluffing. She had an atomic bomb. And she was ready to use it to destroy Arthur's memory and my future. My entire inheritance, my entire future, was built on a foundation of lies. And I knew with a sinking feeling that Brenda Prescott already knew all of it. Just then the phone rang. It was the prison. Jessica was calling me. The prison operator's voice was flat and robotic, a sound that had become sickeningly familiar. You have a collect call from an inmate at the Cook County Department of Corrections. Will you accept the charges? I hesitated for only a second, my mind still reeling from Maria's revelations. I had to know what they wanted. Yes, I said, my voice a dry whisper. Jessica's voice came on the line, but it was different this time. It wasn't the panicked shriek from before, nor was it the whining of her letters. It was cold, confident, and chillingly businesslike. Mom, she said, without any preamble. We need to talk. Mark's mother. She told us you've been digging. She told us you know. I know, I replied, my voice empty of emotion. My husband was a criminal. My daughter was a thief. My world had lost its moral compass. I know about the tax evasion. I know where the money came from. Good, she said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Then you'll understand why you need to listen very carefully. Mark's lawyers have been in negotiations with the federal prosecutor. They have a deal on the table, Mom. A way out of this for everyone. A global settlement. A way out. The words mocked me. My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, felt a flicker of something. A weary, desperate hope that this nightmare could finally end. What kind of deal? I asked, already dreading the answer. It's quite brilliant, actually, she said, the admiration in her voice for her husband's treachery making my stomach turn. Mark will become a cooperating witness. He will provide the government with all of Dad's files on his old partners, the ones who are still alive anyway. He'll testify against them in open court. In exchange for his full cooperation, he gets full immunity. All charges against him, the gambling debts, the other frauds, everything, are dropped. I listened in silence, a cold dread creeping back into my veins. This was their master plan. And you? I asked, my voice flat. The fraud charges against me, they disappear. They'll be dismissed as part of the larger deal. A mother-daughter dispute blown out of proportion. We walk away, Mom. We get to put this all behind us and rebuild our lives. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of it was astounding. They were using my husband's decades-old crimes to erase their own, more personal ones. They were turning my personal tragedy into their get-out-of-jail-free card. And the worst part was, I knew it would probably work. The government would always prefer to prosecute a multi-million-dollar tax evasion ring than a single messy case of family fraud. And what about me? I finally asked, the question feeling heavy and hopeless. What happens to the inheritance? That's the other part of the deal, she said, her voice cautious, as if approaching a frightened animal. Because the money is tainted, most of it will be seized by the IRS as part of the settlement. But the lawyers, as a show of good faith, have negotiated for you to keep the house and $5 million. Free and clear. No questions asked. No charges against you for unknowingly benefiting from illicit funds. $5 million. They were offering me a fraction of my own inheritance, a bribe to buy my silence and their freedom. They were asking me to sanction their crimes, to become their accomplice, in order to save myself. You have 24 hours to agree, Mom, she said, her voice hardening, the final turn of the screw. If you don't, Brenda will leak everything to the press and the IRS. The deal is off the table. Mark and I might go to prison for a few years, but you will lose everything. The house, the money, all of it. You'll be investigated, your name dragged through the mud. You'll be left with nothing. Again. Just pause for a moment and think about this. My own daughter was blackmailing me with my dead husband's crimes to save her own skin. If you think that's the lowest she could sink, you'll want to hear what happened next. I hung up the phone, the ultimatum echoing in the silent room. They thought they had me trapped. They thought the grieving, helpless widow would crumble and accept the scraps they threw her. But they had forgotten one thing. I wasn't that woman anymore. The 24-hour clock was ticking, each second a loud, heavy beat in the silence of Arthur's study. Jessica's threat felt like a physical weight, a pair of concrete hands pressing down on my chest, trying to squeeze the fight out of me. For a fleeting, cowardly moment, I considered their offer. $5 million in the house was more money than I could ever spend. It was the safe option. It was the easy way out. It would mean an end to the fighting, the lawyers, the sleepless nights where I stared at the ceiling and questioned every memory of my 43-year marriage. But the thought of the alternative was what truly sickened me. It would mean letting them win. It would mean justice would not be served. It would mean my daughter and her criminal husband would walk free. Their betrayal erased by a legal loophole. Their cruelty rewarded with a fresh start. The image of their smug, victorious faces, of Brenda Prescott's thin, triumphant smile, was more than I could bear. It was a poison I refused to swallow. I called David Chun and told him everything. It's a clever move, I'll give them that, he admitted, his voice grim over the phone. They've boxed you in. Either way, you stand to lose a fortune. It's not about the money anymore, David, I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. I was pacing back and forth in the study, my eyes scanning the shelves, the neat rows of files, the testament to a life of order and deception. My gaze landed on Arthur's old desktop computer, an imposing black tower he had guarded jealously. He had always been paranoid about cybersecurity, a trait I'd found endearing and slightly eccentric. Now it seemed ominous. Maria, I called out to the investigator, who was packing up her files in the other room. I know you tried, but did you ever manage to get into Arthur's encrypted hard drive? She came to the doorway, shaking her head. The encryption is military-grade, Mrs. Vance. It's a brick wall. I haven't been able to crack it. What was his password usually? I asked, a thought sparking in my mind, a memory of him typing quickly, shielding the keyboard. Usually a combination of your anniversary and his first dog's name, Sparky. David supplied from the speakerphone. I walked over to the computer and sat down in Arthur's old leather chair. The worn seat still held the faint scent of his cigars. I typed in the familiar combination. Access denied. I tried again, reversing the order. Access denied. I closed my eyes and thought about Arthur, about his meticulous, logical mind. What would be important enough to protect with this level of security? It had to be something deeply personal, something that defined him. An idea, a long shot, came to me. I typed in a new password. The exact date, hospital name, and time of day that Jessica had been born. The screen flickered. A green bar appeared. Access granted. There, on the otherwise empty desktop, was a single password-protected folder. Its name gave me chills. It was called Lifeboat. My fingers trembled as I used the same password. The folder opened. Inside was everything. It wasn't just financial records. It was a detailed chronological journal, written by a man in turmoil. Arthur, in the last year of his life, had grown to fear his business partners. He wrote of their greed, their recklessness. He realized he was in over his head with dangerous people, and he was consumed by a deep, profound guilt for what he had done. He had decided to come clean. The folder contained copies of every incriminating document, meticulously annotated with his own explanations. But the most important file was a nearly completed application form. He was preparing to file for whistleblower status with the IRS. David Chen's voice on the speakerphone was a stunned whisper as I described it. My God, Eleanor. The IRS whistleblower program allows citizens who report major tax evasion to receive a substantial percentage, up to 30%, of the money the government recovers. Arthur had planned to turn himself and his partners in. He was going to use the whistleblower reward to create a new clean fortune for us. He had died before he could file the paperwork. The path forward was suddenly brilliantly clear. I wasn't a victim in a blackmail scheme. I was my husband's designated successor. I had the lifeboat. I looked at David on the video call, a fierce, unfamiliar resolve hardening my features. They gave me a 24-hour deadline, I said. That's more than enough time. I wouldn't be blackmailed. I would finish what my husband started. I instructed David to call the IRS whistleblower office. And then I set a trap of my own. The next morning, I made the call that would seal their fate. I phoned Jessica's lawyer, my voice carefully modulated to sound weary and defeated. I've thought about your offer, I said, letting out a sigh for dramatic effect. You're right. A public trial. I can't bear the thought of Arthur's name being dragged through the mud. I'll agree to your terms. I could hear the audible relief in his voice, the smooth sound of a man who believed he had just won. I'm very glad to hear that, Eleanor. You're making the wise choice. We arranged a meeting for 4 o'clock that afternoon at David Chen's office to sign the settlement agreement and the necessary affidavits. He confirmed that Jessica and Mark, who was out on bail, would both be there to finalize everything. It was exactly what I wanted. What he didn't know was that David and I had spent the entire morning in a secure conference room with 2 senior investigators from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Their names were Agent Miller and Agent Rossi, and they were the definition of no nonsense. They listened intently as I walked them through the contents of Arthur's lifeboat folder. They were fascinated by the meticulous evidence Arthur had compiled. But they were even more fascinated and professionally outraged by the Prescott family's attempt to use that information to blackmail a federal witness, me, and to obstruct a massive federal investigation. My cooperation, combined with Arthur's posthumous evidence, was a prosecutor's dream. When I walked into David's conference room that afternoon, I was wearing a simple blue dress. Taped discreetly to my chest, beneath the fabric, was a tiny state-of-the-art recording device. Agent Miller and Agent Rossi were in an adjacent room, listening to and recording every single word. Jessica and Mark were already there, sitting beside their smug-looking lawyer. They looked relaxed, victorious. Mark was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car, and Jessica had managed to get her hair and nails done, even while technically being a guest of the county. They looked like the cat that had swallowed the canary. Mark stood up as I entered, a condescending smile plastered on his face. Eleanor, I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable. This is truly the best outcome for the family. I just want this to be over, I said, my voice soft, playing the part of the broken, compliant widow to perfection. I sat down opposite them, the large mahogany table a battlefield between us. Their lawyer slid a thick stack of papers across the table. This is the settlement agreement. Standard stuff. It stipulates that you will receive $5 million in the house. In return, you agree to drop all prior complaints and attest that this was all a misunderstanding. You will cooperate fully with our version of events. My version of events, Mark corrected him smoothly, leaning forward as if sharing a secret, is the truth. Your husband was a criminal, Eleanor. I was simply trying to protect the family from the fallout. You should be thanking me. The wire I was wearing suddenly felt very hot against my skin. The sheer arrogance was galling. I looked directly at my son-in-law. Tell me, Mark, I said, my voice quiet. I need to understand. When exactly did you find out about Arthur's activities? He chuckled, a low, self-satisfied sound. He leaned back in his chair, basking in his apparent victory, completely oblivious. I've had my suspicions for years. Arthur was clever, but not as clever as he thought. A man moving that much money always leaves a trail if you know where to look. I started putting the real pieces together about a year before he died. I was just waiting for the right time to leverage it. So you knew? I pressed, my voice barely a whisper. You knew the money was tainted when you helped Jessica forge a will to steal it all from me? It was a necessary measure. Jessica piped up, her voice sharp and defensive. We couldn't risk you getting control of dirty money and accidentally exposing us all. We did what we had to do to protect ourselves. Their lawyer was starting to look nervous, sensing his clients were talking too much, but Mark waved him off. He was too arrogant to see the trap. He leaned forward, his voice low and conspiratorial, a predator explaining his technique. Look, Eleanor. The plan was simple. We secure the estate, I used my knowledge of Arthur's crimes to get us a clean bill of health with the feds, and we all walk away rich. Your stubbornness just complicated things. Now sign the papers so we can all get on with our lives." He pushed a pen towards me. I looked down at the documents, then back up at their expectant faces. I gave them a small sad smile. "There's just one problem," I said. "What's that?" Mark asked, his patience finally wearing thin. "You seem to think you're the only ones who have been talking to the government." Just as the color began to drain from their faces, the conference room door swung open. Agent Miller and Agent Rossi walked in, their badges displayed prominently on their belts. "Jessica Prescott and Mark Prescott," Agent Miller said, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, blackmail of a federal witness, and obstruction of justice." The look of pure, unadulterated shock and betrayal on their faces was the truest justice I could have ever hoped for. As they were led away in handcuffs, Jessica, her face contorted in a mask of rage and disbelief, screamed at me, "How could you do this to your own family?" And for the first time I had the perfect answer. "The same way you did, sweetheart. Except my way is legal." The 6 months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, a confusing blur of depositions, hearings, and headlines in the Chicago Tribune. Jessica and Mark's trial was swift, with their recorded confessions from David's office as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Their defense was hopeless. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The judge was particularly scathing in his sentencing, his voice echoing in the solemn courtroom. He spoke of their callous and predatory emotional and financial abuse of an elderly, grieving family member, calling their actions a profound betrayal of the most basic human decencies. Mark, due to his prior financial misdeeds and the gambling connections, received a 10-year federal sentence. Jessica received 7 years for her role in the conspiracy and fraud. I was in the courtroom to see them sentenced, not out of spite, but out of a need for closure. I felt nothing but a sad, empty pity for the daughter I had lost. My whistleblower case with the IRS proceeded in parallel, though much more quietly. The information from Arthur's lifeboat folder was a veritable roadmap to a massive criminal enterprise. It led to the indictment of 7 of his former business partners, and the recovery of over $100 million in unpaid taxes and penalties for the U.S. Treasury. As per the whistleblower law, I was awarded a significant percentage of that recovered amount. After taxes and legal fees, it was less than the $33 million Arthur had left behind, but it was a substantial fortune nonetheless. And more importantly, it was clean. It was legally and morally mine. A strange and complicated legacy earned by finishing the last good deed my husband had started. But I knew I couldn't stay in Chicago. The house on Oakwood Drive, the place I had poured my heart into for 4 decades, was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, haunted by memories of betrayal and sorrow. Every corner held a ghost. Mrs. Gable, my wonderful neighbor, helped me sort through a lifetime of possessions. She held my hand as I decided what to keep, what to donate, and what to leave behind. I sold the house, the furniture, everything. I needed a complete and total break from the past, a geographical cure for a wounded soul. I remembered a vacation Arthur and I had taken years ago to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I remembered the clean, crisp air, the endless rolling hills that looked like a soft green blanket, and the profound sense of peace I'd felt there. On a whim I flew down, rented a car, and just drove. I found a small, charming town nestled in a valley, a place with a real main street, a friendly coffee shop, and a pace of life that felt gentle and healing. I bought a beautiful house on the edge of town, smaller than my one in Chicago, but filled with light. It was a single-story home, with a large garden plot in the back and a sunroom that overlooked the mountains. I knew instantly that the sunroom would be my art studio. For the first time in my life, I was completely on my own. No husband to defer to, no child to care for. The silence was daunting at first, then it became liberating. I bought a sensible Subaru. I learned how to manage my own investments, with the help of a trusted female financial advisor David had recommended. I planted a vegetable garden and took a pottery class at the local community center. And I started to paint again for the first time in 45 years. I was rediscovering the woman I had been before I became Mrs. Arthur Vance. I was rediscovering Eleanor. I was building a new life brick by brick, A life based on my own choices and my own desires. I had money, a new home, and a fragile emerging peace. But as I settled into my new quiet life, I knew there was one last piece of unfinished business. My grandchildren. The letters from Jessica started arriving a few months after she was incarcerated at a low-security federal prison in West Virginia. They came once a week, written on thin, blue-lined prison stationery, her familiar looping handwriting looking alien in this new context. The first few letters were filled with a raw, spitting rage, blaming me, her father, Mark, the lawyers, everyone but herself. Then the tone shifted to a maudlin self-pity, detailed descriptions of the indignities of prison life, and how she cried herself to sleep every night. Finally, they settled into a repetitive rhythm of hollow apologies and pleas for forgiveness. "I know what I did was wrong, Mom," she wrote. "I just want my family back." She wrote about how she missed her children, how she had made a terrible mistake. But in all her pages of remorse, she never once seemed to grasp the depth of her cruelty, only the consequences it had brought upon herself. It was all about her loss, her pain. I read the first 3 letters, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. Then I stopped. I wrote a brief, formal note to the prison warden, instructing them to return all future correspondence to the sender. Forgiveness was a currency she hadn't earned, and I was no longer in the business of handing out free emotional passes. Her betrayal had left a scar on my soul, but I refused to let it become the defining feature of my life. I had a fortune that I hadn't truly earned myself, but was the result of my husband's complex legacy of both brilliance and deceit. I felt a profound responsibility to use it for good, to create something positive from so much pain. I wanted to build a legacy of my own, one that had nothing to do with Arthur's secrets or Jessica's greed. I flew back to Chicago to meet with David Chan in his familiar, comforting office. "I want to start a foundation," I told him, the idea having taken firm root in my mind during my quiet mornings in North Carolina. "I want to help people like me. People who are made to feel old and foolish and useless." And so, the Vance Foundation for Elder Dignity was born. I endowed it with $15 million of my inheritance, a sum that would ensure its work would continue long after I was gone. Its mission was simple and direct: to provide free legal aid and financial counseling to senior citizens who were victims of family financial abuse. We set up a national hotline. We hired a team of passionate young lawyers and social workers who saw their work not as a job, but as a calling. We were a shield for the vulnerable, a voice for the silenced. My story, which I had shared with the authorities, eventually caught the attention of a journalist for a major national magazine. With some hesitation, and only after David vetted her thoroughly, I agreed to an interview. My one condition was that my foundation and its mission were the central focus. The article, titled "The Quiet Comeback," went viral. My story of betrayal and rebirth resonated with thousands of people. Letters and emails poured in from all over the country, from other parents, other widows, other vulnerable people who had suffered in silence. I've been so incredibly humbled by the response. So many people in my situation feel ashamed and stay silent, blaming themselves. But I learned that speaking out isn't just for you. It's for everyone who might come after you. To everyone who has stayed with me on this journey so far, thank you for your patience. If you're still listening, please comment with the number 1, so I know you're still with me. The response I got was overwhelming, and it proved that this was a battle worth fighting. My personal tragedy had become a public cause. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the wronged mother. I was an advocate and activist. I had found a purpose that was bigger than my own pain. But a letter arrived one day that wasn't from my daughter. It was from a lawyer representing my grandchildren's interests, and it contained a request I never saw coming. The letter was from a court-appointed guardian ad litem, a lawyer assigned by the family court to protect the legal interests of my 2 grandchildren, who were now living full-time with Mark's sister and her family. The stationery was crisp and official, and the tone was formal. The letter stated that my daughter, Jessica, from prison, was petitioning the court for me to set up a substantial trust fund for the children's future. The proposal suggested it be managed by a neutral third-party bank to ensure fairness. My first reaction was a surge of hot, familiar anger. Even from behind bars, she was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to manipulate me. She was using her own children as pawns, attempting to secure their financial future while painting herself as a concerned mother. All with my money. It was a strategic self-serving move and I saw right through it. For a full day, I was tempted to have David draft a scathing refusal. But then I looked at the most recent school photos of my grandchildren on my mantelpiece. Their innocent smiles, their bright eyes that held no knowledge of the sordid mess their parents had created. They were the true victims in all of this. They would grow up with the stigma of having parents who were convicted felons. They didn't deserve to be punished for the sins of Jessica and Mark. But they also couldn't be allowed to grow up with the same sense of entitlement, the same belief that money was a solution to all problems, that had so thoroughly poisoned their mother. I spent a week thinking about it, walking through my garden and sketching in my sunroom studio. I wasn't just planning a financial trust. I was designing a life lesson. I decided I would do it, but not on her terms or the court's. It would be on mine. I flew back to Chicago and met with the guardian ad litem in person. I told her I would establish a substantial multi-million-dollar trust for each grandchild. But I would be the sole trustee, and the terms would be non-negotiable. The funds would be completely locked until each child turned 25 years old. And there were conditions, what I called clauses of character. To access a single penny of the money, they would first have to graduate from an accredited 4-year university or a certified trade school. They would have to complete a certified course in personal financial literacy and investing. And finally, the most important clause, they would each have to volunteer for a minimum of 100 hours at the Vance Foundation, working directly with the victims my foundation served. I want them to learn the value of work, the importance of education, and the meaning of compassion. I told the lawyer, my voice firm. I am giving them a safety net, not a golden parachute. Before they can inherit a fortune, they must understand the value of a dollar and the cost of human cruelty. I want them to see firsthand what happens when families are torn apart by greed. The lawyer, and later the family court judge, agreed completely, calling the terms wise and prudent. My business with the past was finally completely finished. Today, as I'm recording this, the afternoon sun is streaming into my art studio in North Carolina, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The walls are covered with my paintings, bright landscapes, colorful abstracts, portraits of the kind people I've met in my new town. On the easel in the center of the room is my latest work, a self-portrait. The woman in the painting is 68 years old. There are lines around her eyes and her hair is silver, but her gaze is clear and direct. She isn't smiling, but she looks content. She looks strong. She looks free. That woman is who I am now. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brought you some sense of justice, maybe even some inspiration. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Most importantly, if you or someone you know has faced a similar family betrayal, please share your experience in the comments below, if you feel comfortable. You need to know that your voice deserves to be heard. You are not useless. You are powerful.